we as Wesleyans would say, the good that we see people doing is a reflection of God. It is a reflection of the DNA that we have. Yeah, it's a reflection of who God is and how God is working in each individual life.
Marcus Aurelius said, "What we do in life echoes through eternity." What is your life echoing through eternity? Welcome to Echoes Through Eternity with Dr. Jeffrey Skinner. Our mission is to inspire, engage, and encourage leaders from across the globe to plant missional churches and be servant leaders. So join us and hear the stories of servant leaders reverberating lives as God echoes them through eternity. Brought to you by Missional Church Planting and Leadership Development and Dynamic Church Planting International.
Well, hello. Welcome into Echoes Through Eternity. I'm your host, Dr. Jeffrey D. Skinner. I am joined in the studio today with Tiana Sundberg, and she and her husband, Jay, are missionaries over right now they're in Poland. That is not where they've always served, but that's where they're serving right now. And they're helping with a lot of the Ukrainian crisis over there and just the heartbreaking stories that you hear coming out of there, but also the hope that we hear coming from there, as well as God uses Tiana and her husband, Jade, just to be hope and grace and a means of grace in people's lives over there. Welcome in, Tiana.
Well, thank you, Dr. Skinner. It's lovely to be here with you today, and you have a hello from my husband, Jay. So thank you for the invitation.
Great. Your kids are here in America right now, or at least some of them are, and you got 4 girls, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, we have 4 adult daughters. Yes, 3 of them are in the U.S. studying, 2 in their bachelor's degrees, 1 in her master's degree, and we have 1 daughter that's here working at the border at this time.
Cool. Fantastic. And y'all have, now, as your family, they've grown up over in missions, right?
Yep, right. So all of our girls spent all of their life growing up in Eastern Europe. So their first experience of living in the U.S. happened when they went to university.
Wow. I have heard many missionary kids talk about the adaptation required when they re-enter the United States from living, outside of the U.S. We have a completely different perspective on life and way of life even. And sometimes that's good. Sometimes it's bad. You can get, kind of focused on and distracted, I should say, with everything going on when you're here in the United States, and we forget how blessed we really are, but simultaneously how we take those blessings for granted, and we end up they get in the way sometimes, I think, of God's blessings on us. Anyway, so great to have you here. So tell us a little bit about. I'm always curious. I know God. It's always interesting to me how God uses the twists and turns in our life to kind of shape us and mold us for his purposes. And just things that happened to us, 10 or 15 years ago, we look at now and we think, wow, how God used that for today. Talk a little bit about how you and Jay and your family discerned your call to missions and everything that goes with that.
Oh, that's a big question, but I'll give you the abbreviated version. Sure. If Jay were here, I think he would say that he felt a call to missions when he was around 9 or 10 years old. Of course, he grew up in the Nazarene parsonage. His dad was a pastor, and his family was deeply involved in ministry. Missionary came, and that missionary was a doctor. And so Jay, I think, sensed God's call on his heart to be a missionary at that service, and assumed that meant that he was supposed to go into medical missions. Things played out differently for him as he went to university. We met at Mid-America. And so by the time we met at Mid-America, Jay was on the road to be, he was studying to be a pastor. So he was in the religion department. And I think he had, at that point, decided that God's call was not necessarily so much toward missions, but toward pastoring and serving God, however that would look, but he maybe assumed that it would be as a pastor. And I received my missions call when I was 14. I didn't grow up in a Christian home, but accepted the Lord when I was 14. And then soon after that, I actually had a call to missions. But having not grown up in the church, my concept of what a missionary was very limited. But I was pretty sure that what that was. That thing of being a missionary was something that I didn't want to do. So I have a very funny story of how God really worked with me through that. And it's a beautiful story. I won't go into it now, but when the wall fell, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Jay and I were both seniors at Mid-America Nazarene University. So I'm giving a shout out to MNU.
Wow.
And, and so that happened as our senior year at university. Chuck and Carla, who are Jay's older brother and sister-in-law, went to Russia in 1992. So they were the pioneer missionaries for the Church of the Nazarene after the Berlin Wall fell and communism fell and the Soviet world, post-Soviet world opened up. Chuck and Carla came back for General Assembly, and Jay had just graduated from seminary, and I was teaching in KCK. And Chuck got off the plane, and Jay picked him up, and he said, "I want to talk to you about your future." And so Chuck asked if we would come for 2 years to Russia to help pastor the church in Moscow. And so, long story short, we said yes. It was an adventure. And that was really then the beginning of, I think, God bringing together that idea or that concept of our call to missions. So we went to Russia in 1994, just 4.5 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We expected to be there for 2 years. That was our original commitment. And it's 28 years later, and we are still missionaries with the Church of the Nazarene. So
28 years later. That's amazing. And you guys have done amazing work. We were talking before the podcast. I think it was 2015 or so that we first crossed paths, and I heard your guys' story. And at that time, you guys were working with the Syrian crisis. We don't think about a Syrian crisis in Russia, but tell us a little bit about the work that you guys did there.
Let me backtrack a little bit and say, we lived in Moscow, Russia for 4 years, and we learned to speak Russian. Not well, not beautifully, not without error, but we did learn to communicate and speak in Russian, which I'm very grateful for. Then in 1998, we moved to Sofia, Bulgaria, and we spent 13 years in Bulgaria. The Bulgarian language is not exactly like Russian, but it's similar. They share similar roots. It's a Slavic language, Slavic alphabet. And so we continue to try to keep our Russian alive and learned to speak Bulgarian. And that's where we raised our girls for the first part of their lives. And I became ordained during that time. And then we moved to Hungary, to Budapest, Hungary. And we lived in Hungary for 9 years. So in 2015, we're living in Hungary, and that's when the crisis with the flow of Middle Eastern displaced peoples into Europe then began. And it began at the Keleti train station in the center of Budapest where we were living. And so that's how we got involved, because we had thousands of people suddenly stranded in the Keleti train station. And so I put the girls in school and went down to the train station to see what was happening and what we could do. And that's how that interaction then began. That actual change, and it became a key point in my life and my ministry, actually.
Good. Yeah, I love the idea that, so often we have an idea of what we want to do. And so then we do it and we ask God to join it. What you guys have a history of doing is seeing where God is working and joining God where he is working there. And that's what you did there is you were living your life, you're serving God. And then suddenly this crisis hits and you're like, okay, here's an opportunity for us to be Christ to others. And you were and still are in so many different ways. How has that shaped your children's lives? I mean, I can't imagine some of the ways that has shown up.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your kind words. And if we come back to it, I want to tell you a little bit about how God actually prepared us for what happened in 2015. But to answer your question about the girls, our girls would I think if I can speak for them, they're thankful for having grown up in Eastern Europe. They defend Eastern European culture, and they consider themselves to be a part of Eastern European culture. They have memories, which I think are positive memories of being in Roma homes and being taken places and being part of work and witness teams and university teams that would come, and we would take them around to different spaces and to meet different people. So they are very much daughters of or children of this place that they grew up in. When they moved to America to go to university, they've all struggled with culture shock because this is very much home for them. But when the refugee situation began in 2015, our oldest daughter, Lexi, was at university at Trevecca. So now I'm giving Trevecca a shout out. But the other three were at home. And so they would go with us to the border. They all helped in Budapest. And then we were able to move to other countries. I mean, continued to live in Hungary, but we were able to go to the borders and the transit zones in other countries to help. And I think all of our girls, when you talk with them, you will find that there is a thick vein of justice and a strong understanding that we are called to be, that reflecting God means that we care about the other and that we welcome the other. And so all of our girls, even in the degrees that they're seeking, there is a component of that really is justice oriented. Our oldest daughter, Lexi, graduated from Trevecca and then went to Queen's University in Belfast and graduated with a degree in peace and reconciliation conflict transformation. And she's, as I said, at the border now working in Przemyśl. She's been there for 5 months, which is a long time to be at a border responding.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's good. You can be a co-creator with God by helping to echo our guest voices, share our episodes with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Give us positive 5-star reviews. The more positive reviews we have, the more visibility we have, and the more voices that are echoed through eternity. We often invite guests who are serving faithfully year after year, often in anonymity in their respective roles and ministries. God sees them, and the reality is for a good kingdom leader, that's enough. We do not do what we do for the accolades of humanity. We do it because we're called by God. But I believe that God uses people like you and I to continue those reverberations and echo them throughout eternity. You can partner with God by liking, subscribing, writing a quick positive 5-star review, and again, sharing those voices with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Those reviews will eventually lead to other guests who have larger platforms that have more listeners who will then in turn listen to the show. And again, it further echoes those voices, which is the whole vision of the Echoes Through Eternity podcast here, is to continue echoing those voices that God is echoing through eternity there. So like and subscribe and review us if you would. We'd appreciate that greatly. Now, you said you wanted to circle back to how God prepared you guys for 2015. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, because I think it's just amazing what God did. Well, and so let me just underline the fact that in 1994 when we went to Russia, we learned Russian, right? But we only lived there for 4 years, which was a big investment in language, in a very difficult language. For just a short period of time, it would have seemed that way. But then in 2015, the crisis began in late August of 2015. But in March or April, probably around March of that year, I was in our kitchen in Budapest making dinner. I very vividly remember I was peeling potatoes and I was listening to a news story while I was doing that, and it was actually a documentary about the orphans that were a result of the war in Syria. And as I was working in my kitchen, nobody else was home, I really, really sensed that God was speaking to me. And I don't say that glibly, because I would say there are very few times in my life where I would say God just verbally spoke to me, but I really felt God speak to me and say, well, would you go? And I thought, right. Well, that's such a silly question. that's not how it works in the Church of the Nazarene. You don't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to Syria. And besides that, there's a conflict and all of these things. So it was very much God asking me would I go. And it was I sensed very much a question of obedience. And of course, there was the factor of Jay, was God speaking to Jay about that as well? But eventually in that little conversation with God in my kitchen, I said, well, if you're asking about obedience, then the answer is yes. Yes, I would go. So that is for me, that is such a key point, because there was no way that I could have known that 2 or 3 months later, the refugees from Syria and also displaced people from the Middle East would actually literally show up on my doorstep in Budapest. And so God brought that. I mean, God brought that to my doorstep, and I had already answered the question of, would we go? Yeah, we would.
Yeah. It's amazing how God prepares our heart ahead of time for things that we have no inkling that are coming our way. Nobody knew that was brewing. And then I heard we have a mutual friend, Jacob Morris, and his wife, and they were Trevecca students, I think, at the time. I was sharing earlier that we have a connection with them. They were in our what we call an impact team here over in Alabama, not here in Alabama. I'm in Georgia. But during that time, God worked with them and called them. And Kathy Mulry is a professor at Trevecca, very deeply involved in the missions curriculum over there and teaching. She's told that story, and it's just amazing how the paths intersect and how God uses all those stories. I mean, we're living we talk a lot in the West about individuality, but God uses the community. It may be our individual lives, that those lives are nothing without the intersection with the other. And so I love the fact that you guys have spent your lives serving the other, in whatever way that God has called you to do that. And it shaped your children, as you talked about. They all had culture shock when they came here. And I have never lived anywhere other than the United States. And so I have no idea what that's like, but I do recognize that we are unique people, and that sometimes our perspectives are not as clear as we think they are. But we talked a little bit about your past work with refugees. Tell us now. So where were you guys serving when the war in Ukraine broke out? Were you in Poland at that time?
Yeah, we had already moved to Poland. Okay. So we lived in Budapest for 9 years. And then 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, we moved to Poland. My husband, Jay, is the field strategy coordinator for Central Europe. And Central Europe includes the Balkan Peninsula. It also includes Scandinavia. And then it includes the Central European countries, which would be Hungary and Poland. And so we, in 2015, with that situation, and actually Jacob and Dorothea came because we invited them to come and be a part of what we were developing through Courage for the Journey and CM Central Europe to respond to the refugees. And actually that response continues today. That response is not over. So we moved to Poland 2 years ago. It's part of our field, never imagining that the war in Ukraine would happen. So February 24, of course, we were watching the news and we had realized that maybe something would happen. And February 24, we were here in Poznan. We live in Poznan, which is close to Berlin, Germany. It's close to the German border. It's about 6.5 hour drive from Przemyśl, which is the border town, the Polish border town with Ukraine. So when Putin attacked Ukraine on February 24, we had already put into motion plans to go to the border if, in fact, something happened. And so we arrived at the border of Przemyśl about 4 days after the war started. But we already, before we could get there, other Nazarenes had already arrived at the border. And I would love to talk to you about those Nazarenes and who they were. So our pastor in Warsaw, Rafi Habib, is from Syria. He and his mother, Elena, and his father came from Syria in 2016. and they settled in Poland. They were able to come because of a donation that was given by a Nazarene in the UK who helped to bring several Christians from Syria to Poland. So Rafi and Lena, who were part of the church in Syria, in Damascus, were living in Warsaw, and they started the Arab Church of the Nazarene in Warsaw, which ministers to refugees and displaced people there. When the war, Rafi is married to Anya, who is from Ukraine, and Anya's parents are actually, Anya's mother and family actually live in Kharkiv. And so when the war started, the day that the war started on the 24th of February, Rafi called and he said, "We're going to the border. We can't wait. We're going." And so Rafi and Anya and Rafi's two nephews, who were also refugees from Syria, who had also experienced all that means to be displaced, packed up their car and they drove to the border and set up, they were some of the first foreigners to set up a booth in Shemesh to give out food and to help people. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an important story for people to hear, that a Syrian refugee and a Ukrainian woman and two Syrian nephews, when that happened, because of their experience, they took the initiative to go, and they were some of the first foreigners that were there helping.
And so then, isn't that interesting, that whole, how those lives intersected there? So you're all working Syrian, and the Syrians work with the Ukrainians. And you said Kharkiv, that's Ukraine, right?
Yeah, that would be one of the heaviest. So if you're listening to the news and you're listening to what's happening, then Kharkiv would be one of the places that actually was hardest hit by the Russian forces. And Anya's mom, in March, April, I can't remember now exactly, but her mom was there when the bombing happened, and they actually lost contact with her for 10 days and didn't know whether she was alive or dead. They had to wait 10 days to get a response from her.
I can't imagine waiting 10 days to find out if your child was alive or dead. You know, that's amazing.
Her mother. It was her mother. Yeah.
Her mother. Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the where, I mean, you know, again, obviously in the U.S. and on the news, they thrive off of bad news. Where are you guys seeing hope amongst your work today?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the most beautiful pieces is something that Jay often says. You know, when we're in Shemesh, which is, if I can explain, right across just a few kilometers, 21 kilometers, I think, from Lviv, across the border is the border town of the Polish border town of Shemesh. So people who are coming from Lviv, escaping Ukraine, they can come by train, and the train brings them from Lviv into Shemesh. Or people from Lviv, if they have cars and they're driving, or if they're coming by foot, then they cross the border at Medica, which is the other option for a crossing. Both of those would be official border points. So you can stand at Medica, which is probably, 15 kilometers from Lviv, maybe more, but not far. And you can look across that border and you can say, you know, that just a few kilometers makes a difference between chaos and freedom, and understanding that what's happening with that. But also you can watch the volunteers, and there have been thousands of people who have come to help from all different parts of the world, including Ukrainians who are there volunteering to helping people. And you can say, Jay often says, you know, you can look at this war and you can see the worst in humanity by what's happening with Putin, what he's chosen to do.
Right.
But you can also look at this situation and see the very best of humanity, the most beautiful aspect of humanity.
Yeah.
People who are coming to respond and to love and to help. And so, you know, not everyone that's volunteering and helping are Christians. They're not all believers. There are people from the secular world. There are people that are atheists. We've stood side by side with people who are anarchists, you know, that are there helping. But we as Wesleyans would say, that the good that we see people doing is a reflection of God. It is a reflection of the DNA that we have. It's a reflection of who God is and how God is working in each individual life.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a building, on a hill, in your home, on a beach, in real life, and online. Multitudes are coming to Christ around the world, but there's a shortage of healthy churches. On every continent of the world, Christians like you have learned exactly how to start a church with DCPI's free, step-by-step training based on God's Word to equip you to reach your community with the good news of Jesus Christ. Dynamic Church Planting International wants to come alongside you or your organization for free. No strings attached, no hidden cost, no subscriptions. We equip you absolutely free. Our mission is to equip servant leaders to plant 5 million churches. Go to dcpi.org for more details. That's dcpi.org.
As you were talking there, I think so often the church's response, or I should say the Christian's response sometimes, is to try to escape from the chaos. And that wasn't the model that Jesus gave for us. Jesus entered into the chaos and brought peace. I think sometimes we create the absence of chaos, or I hesitate to use the word peace, because peace in terms of the kingdom is wholeness, not lack of conflict. But I think we misunderstand what peace is, and we think that when God is present, that everything's just going to be peaceful, so to speak, because there's not going to be any chaos there. But often that is where we find God, is in the midst of that chaos, and He is bringing that calm in the midst of the chaos. I think it's such a beautiful, the way you describe it is so beautiful out there, in working side by side, even with anarchists, which would seem antithetical to what an anarchist would do or be, which I think is even more of a testimony of the fact that that's God showing up. Throughout the Bible, we see God using bad kings to bring about His will. So why couldn't He use an anarchist or an atheist even to do that? So great stuff there. What would you say the biggest challenge that you guys see there right now, besides just the sheer number of people?
Well, I think, the numbers of people are part of the challenge, because it is obviously not, the numbers are not the same as in March and April, when there were just these huge flows of people. Now we see many people coming from Ukraine, but we also see people returning to Ukraine, almost 50-50 in terms of, at least through the summer. So one of the biggest challenges is understanding what happened. What is happening with those people who are returning to Ukraine? Are they returning? Many of them, when you chat with them, many of them will tell you, I'm just going home for a week. In fact, I just had a conversation with one of the Ukrainian ladies that's part of our coffee shop, and she said, Tiana, I think I want to go home for a week and see my husband and see our apartment. So people are going back to say goodbye, or to see their husbands or their families or their cats and dogs that they left behind. To see their apartment, and then planning to return, or thinking that they might return. So there's a huge question for us. What is happening? What does the future hold? Our decision has been, we're going to stay through December, probably through April. Other organizations have left because the numbers have not stopped, but they've diminished. But our decision as Nazarenes, as NCM, has been, we'll stay. Because there's a big question about the winter. We know historically, if you look at history and the decisions that have been made by Russia, then often winters are harsh, and those winters can be utilized as an opportunity. So we maintain a presence there, and the challenge has been then, how do we navigate? How do we prepare for the future? How do we prepare for the worst and pray for the best in the winter? And how do we decide how long we stay and when we leave? But we are not leaving, we're staying, and we're continuing. And the numbers actually have started to pick up, unfortunately, in the last few weeks again.
Putin has begun to threaten, I guess, using tactical nuclear weapons and things like that.
Yeah.
Perspective wise, I have no idea how that affects you guys and your work there. I mean, obviously it would be bad.
Yeah. Well, it's sobering. I had a sobering moment a week and a half ago, right after Putin made his address, because I had to write an email that said, we need to order iodine tablets. Because if he follows through, we need to have iodine tablets on hand for our 2 locations in case something would happen. In March, when the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia was first compromised by Russian forces, that was another very sobering day, because if you understand anything about what happened with Chernobyl, then Zaporizhia is, I believe, 6 times larger than Chernobyl.
Wow.
And so I would say there is a very, how big the threat is,
Right.
I don't know, because I'm not an expert, but
sure.
Yeah, certainly there's a threat. There's a threat,
Yeah.
and there's a fear.
Yeah. Well, again, from a Western perspective, our news, I just re-engaged Neil Postman's book, Entertaining Ourselves to Death. It's an old book, but he, even way back in 1984, 86, whenever it was first written, he talked a lot about the advent of television. And he almost prophetically saw, and of course, social media was on nobody's radar at that point, but he almost prophetically saw what it has become today, and that it's just a source of entertainment. And so, as opposed to just a source of information. And so, we live in silos now. And so everybody, even within the same particular country, you can live in a different ideological silo, and you just kind of customize your news to whatever you want. But what are something that we aren't hearing that you wish people would know about the current crisis there from our American side that we probably aren't hearing in our American silo?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, and thanks for this opportunity. First of all, I want to celebrate the spirit of Ukrainians. I want to celebrate who they are and the strength of the Ukrainian character. And you're right, the news media is cyclical, and so probably the war in Ukraine has kind of, in some sense, passed out of the minds of people. But I actually want to bring that back and not only talk about the strength of the character of Ukrainians, but I also want to highlight some other places, because when we talk about displacement, or we talk about refugeeism, migration flows, and by the way, part of my story is that having been a part of 2015 and then 2022 with Ukraine, I actually began my PhD journey. And so I'm working on my PhD in mass migration movements with Biola University. Now I'm giving Biola University a shout out. And specifically looking at violence and othering at transit points. So this issue of displacement and refugeeism, every expert will predict that the world will increasingly deal with larger and larger numbers of displaced people.
Right.
So I said earlier in this interview that in 2015, there were 1.5 million people displaced over 7 months into Europe from the Middle East. With the war in Ukraine, it was 1.5 million people in 7 days.
Wow.
So that gives you some kind of a scope. But it's not only the war in Ukraine that is producing displaced people. I want to highlight the fact that in Iran, we now have thousands of people because of the uprising in Iran. Again, a very heroic encounter where Iranian young people predominantly are saying no to certain things and actually laying down their lives in order to see change, social and political change in Iran. Thousands of people, Iranians, are leaving Iran, and people are responding. Believers are responding, and that people are becoming to know the Lord through that situation. But also, I want to celebrate the fact that there are thousands of Russians who have now left Russia and one of the countries on our field that is receiving the majority of them. There are not a lot of places in Europe where Russians can go, but lots of thousands are going to Serbia, which is another country on our field where we're working with refugees.
Right.
And so there are Russians who are standing up and saying no to their government and literally risking their lives to say no. We have Afghanis. So the Afghanis are fleeing. We again, in Serbia, we are working there with a refugee space. 1,400 Afghani men every 4 days rotate into that space in Serbia as displaced people. So Russians, Ukrainians, Iranian people from Iran, Syrians, Afghanis, and there are many, many more. And so the issue of displacement for the church, this has to be refugeeism. This has to be a focus for the church. And we need to figure out how we do that. And I will now say, and the situation on our border in the U.S., right? The response of the church there needs to be a response, and it needs to be a response reflective of who God is and who Jesus was and is.
Right. So, how regarding the infrastructure? I mean, one of the things I've seen on the news there is they just, there's just no place for a lot of these people to go. How do they manage caring for all those people and employment and just, I mean, when you're displaced like that, I mean, there's just so many, you literally have no place to live. And so it's not like you just move, pick up and back a U-Haul up to your home and, drive across the border there. So you have maybe a suitcase, and if you've got young children, their needs. How do they manage all that infrastructure and for those displaced people there?
Right. So yes, we've said, one of the most beautiful aspects of this is that you see Ukrainian women single-handedly carrying a generation of children out of a war zone in March and April. And so the beauty and the strength of women, I want to highlight that. As an ordained woman myself, I would say, the beauty and the strength of women needs to be highlighted, and it needs to be talked about. The infrastructure you asked about, the EU, there is, when there's a crisis like this, of course there are EU monies that flow in, and then there are different organizations and processes where you can apply for money, and so those responses happen. They don't happen immediately though, and so you have, I think, over the first 3 to 4 months of this war, this crisis, you can see that there were people, just average, ordinary people, or organizations, NGOs, small or NGOs, NCM, our Nazarene Compassionate Ministries organization. In essence, we're kind of a small NGO, and yet do really big things to respond in those points in those spaces before the big NGOs actually show up. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure that I exactly answered that question.
You're talking about, I just happened to think when you were talking about our border and everything, and a lot of times there's just so much chaos everywhere. There's a border there and people running across. And I just think infrastructure, how do countries handle that influx there? Because we don't do a very good job of it here. I mean, they come across and then they just disappear, and they become an underclass. I mean, they become, just in poverty, incessant poverty, and no access to the system or the levers of power or anything like that. And so they become exploited. And that's where I get concerned is the exploitation and just the poverty. And it almost seems my wife teaches down about 30 miles from our home here towards Atlanta, and 96% of her students, English is their second language. And a lot of them are, I don't know if you call them displaced people. I'm not sure, but they have left. They did not use the proper channels to enter into the United States. Their parents did not. And what you see is just they struggle in the schools because a lot of them don't speak the language. A lot of them don't have resources at home to really get access to that. And so they fail in school. How do we handle that?
Well, I want to emphasize a couple of things. I think, first of all, when we talk about the decisions that their parents made or decisions that people make to cross borders, and we love to use these words of legal and illegal, but having worked at borders and transit zones, let me just say that those words and how those systems happen are not so cut and dried. So, we can label a person as illegal, which is a very unfair label, because when people are in the situations of displacement that they're in, those systems that have been set up by governments to receive people, those systems change. They change with new governments and new politicians. And so it's just not this cut and dried, these people are bad and these people are good. It's really, really not like that. So that's number one. Number two, I'll just leave it. I'll leave it there with that. But I do want to say, I want to be careful, but I want to say, regardless of how people come, there is a level of dignity and a level of humanity or humanizing that we are responsible for as a church. And I think beyond that, even if you don't consider yourself a believer, there is just a level of what it means to treat someone with humanly, humanely, and that includes seeing people as people, not as an illegal, not as somebody who has a different skin color or who speaks a different language than we do, or even has a different political or religious background than we do, but just actually seeing people and understanding that they have the same values, they love their families, they care about the same things that we care about, right? And they deserve to be treated and to be treated as humans and to be welcomed.
Right.
And so structures that help people, I would also say, but most non-Americans that I know speak more than one language and learn that in childhood. And so, yes, we have Ukrainians who are coming to Poland and other places in Europe, and they're learning to speak German, or they're learning to speak Danish, or they're learning to speak Polish. And the young kids that are coming from Mexico, or that have their first language is not English, they are learning how to speak English. So those structures are difficult. I'm a teacher myself. I'm an English education. That's my first degree, and I taught. Yes, sometimes that makes it, there are difficulties that come with that, but also if you watch people who are immigrants, they by far, if you look at the trajectory, the statistics, you will see that those people are motivated to learn and to excel, often much more than people, young people from the host country itself.
Yeah. So we definitely, I mean, my wife, she has generally taught, well, she just taught all over the place, but she'll definitely tell you that our kids are not as motivated to learn as what they need to. My own kids, I have to stay on them, not everywhere has access to the education that you have access to. You need to appreciate this stuff, and I mean, in Afghanistan, they'll blow you up if you're a girl and try to get an education. They want to kill you. We had the story many years back of the young lady that kind of became the symbol of that. So, well, it has been such a joy having you, Miss Tiana. One last question I had for you. Is there any way, I know you guys are missionaries, and Church of Nazarene has shifted structures and things like that, and how they support different missionaries in different times. Is there a website people go to support you guys, to help you guys in your efforts over there if they wanted to do that?
Wow. Okay. Well, I should have been prepared for that, and I'm not. Let me just say that quickly. Let me just give a shout out. I want to shout out. I talked about Lexi and Sophia, who graduated at Trevecca. I want to say my daughter Lydia at Point Loma, and my daughter Jenna at Northwest Nazarene University. You graduated from there, and my MA from NNU. I want to shout out all of those universities because all of them have had a presence at the border over this season, and actually in 2015 as well. And our girls have been at the border, and I've appreciated what they've done as well. So I think the easiest thing, I'll just say, if you find me on Facebook, Tiana Sundberg, or you find me on Instagram at T Sundberg, just the letter T in my last name, Sunberg. Follow me at one of those two spaces. That's a great way then to follow links for giving. We do have a link with Nazarene as Nazarene missionaries. If somebody connects with me on one of those media outlets, then I will be glad to from there give a link.
Good. And I'll make sure I put that in the show notes too, your social media stuff and links and things like that, because, I do know it's important for you guys and I know missionaries, they come home every few years and the word escapes me, they use that. When you come home, it's not sabbatical.
Home assignment. No, not sabbatical. No, sabbatical is a beautiful rest.
You're working
home
when
assignment
you're here.
Is absolutely. We're double time working. So in your show notes, another thing that in your show notes, I would really encourage people to check. I will give you something. It's a link to our newsletter. It's called Epistle Today, and that is an awesome place. If anybody was going to follow Epistle Today, you would message me and with your email address, and let me know that you want to be put on the newsletter. Because that's a great way to see what's happening. We update it weekly, and our links for giving are there as well.
Yeah. So definitely. And I encourage, if you're listening to the show, connect with them, subscribe to her newsletter. It's well written, is stories of hope and inspiration. You will not be disappointed, and it will pull you out of your silo, I think is what I would say. Is that we like to kind of stay in our little sphere of influence there. But what you find is when you get pulled out of your silo and you allow God to connect you with other stories, it changes you and it affects you. But we appreciate, again, just so grateful for you and your husband, Jay's work over there, your faithfulness to God and the kingdom of God. And it's been great having you today. Okay.
Thanks so much, Dr. Skinner. Thank you for the time and the conversation.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
You too.
You can be a co-creator with God by helping to echo our guest voices, share our episodes with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Give us positive 5-star reviews. The more positive reviews we have, the more visibility we have, and the more voices that are echoed through eternity. We often invite guests who are serving faithfully year after year, often in anonymity in their respective roles and ministries. God sees them, and the reality is for a good kingdom leader, that's enough. We do not do what we do for the accolades of humanity. We do it because we're called by God. But I believe that God uses people like you and I to continue those reverberations and echo them throughout eternity. You can partner with God by liking, subscribing, writing a quick positive 5-star review, and again, sharing those voices with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Those reviews will eventually lead to other guests who have larger platforms that have more listeners who will then in turn listen to the show. And again, it further echoes those voices, which is the whole vision of the Echoes Through Eternity podcast here, is to continue echoing those voices that God is echoing through eternity there. So like and subscribe and review us if you would. We'd appreciate that greatly.